Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of the ENO Center for Transportation webinars. I'm Brianne Eby, a policy analyst here at ENO. Today, we're presenting our latest report, Tools for a Smoother Ride, Managing Rail Assets and Leveraging Competition. With high-profile closures and disruptions to rail systems across the U.S., the condition of rail infrastructure is very much in the public eye. These systems need major track maintenance overhauls, but the real overhaul needs to be in how agencies conduct asset management and maintenance programs. The more maintenance is deferred, the more it will cost to return to a state of good repair in the future, and the less reliable the service will become for riders. True plans and processes based on the actual observed condition of the infrastructure is needed. This approach requires structural and cultural change and significantly more initial investment to coordinate data from sensor, monitoring devices, and human observation. In some cases, private contractors can be used to perform some or all of track maintenance. If done carefully, private contracting can create a different set of incentives and accountability than some agencies rely on today. Today, we have report authors Paul Lewis, ENO's Vice President of Policy and Finance, and Malcolm Kenton, an independent consultant, joining us to talk through the findings from this report on rail maintenance program needs and practices. Through dozens of interviews with public and private stakeholders around the country, the authors discovered a consensus on the need for better asset management practices to meet today's maintenance challenges. After Paul and Malcolm present the report findings, we'll have plenty of time for questions. For those of you listening in, you're encouraged to submit questions and comments through the questions function on the webinar website. You don't have to wait until the speakers are done to submit questions. You can do this at any point throughout the presentation. Please know that the slides will be posted online after this webinar. Thank you all again for taking the time to join us today. And with that, take it away, Paul and Malcolm.
Thanks, Brianne. I'm going to run through a couple slides here and give you all a brief overview of what the paper is, what we found, and what we recommended. We started this paper, which is about maintaining rail transit systems, because it was prompted by two crises. First, the amount of system delays nationwide related to deferred maintenance is growing, particularly in some high-profile instances in major cities. And at the same time, the mileage of new rail systems is increasing. So if we don't solve the first problem and find an effective way to maintain our systems, the problem will only grow as the new systems that are coming online also begin to age. And so first and foremost, we have to recognize that funding has to be part of the answer to the problem. Consistent reports going back decades demonstrate that the U.S. is not adequately funding maintenance departments. Track workers and maintenance managers know this very well. But as Brianne said, the research found that the real overhaul needs to happen in the approach to maintenance. The recommendations in this paper can make the systems more performance-based, make them more reliable, and make them more accountable to the riding public. Readers will note that this paper has a heavy emphasis on contracting. That exists because ENO's been doing a lot of work on contracting. This past fall, we worked with Transit Center, a philanthropy based in New York City, and released a paper called A Bid for Better Transit. We focused in this paper on contracting for service operations in public transit, knowing that many European agencies contract out their bus and rail operations. So in A Bid for Better Transit, we asked, why don't we do it here in the U.S.? And if so, how can we do it responsibly? We started this work on maintenance with the same thinking. What is the role of contracting in the rail maintenance realm and in the public transit space? So we interviewed, as part of this, dozens of private and public sector stakeholders and quickly found that we were kind of starting in the wrong place. Before a discussion of contracting can really occur, agencies must do a better job in managing their assets. So I'm going to go through a little bit of some of the terms and definitions we use in the paper and before talking about our recommendations. So first, there were three important definitional distinctions to make. First, we're talking about rail maintenance. The rail is both the rail and the track, the subsurface, bridges, tunnels, signal systems,
Dial into the cell phone.
Hi, folks. Hopefully you can all hear me now. I think that the phone system cut out. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties, so I'm going to back up a minute or two, and hopefully you all can get you caught up. So, so that on a definitional standpoint, and I think this is where you may have lost it. We're talking about rail and track infrastructure, which is both the infrastructure for the rail, the substructure, the signal systems, the bridges, the tunnels, everything that goes into it. Rail maintenance refers to both the repair and the rehab, the capital and the operations, the short term, the long term. You can't have maintenance without thinking both about the operational maintenance and about the long term capital. And then finally, the contracted versus in-house definitions. When we talk about a contracted approach, this is really referring to both the indefinite quantity, indefinite delivery, IDIQ kind of approach, where it's what WMATA did on its safe track, where it's kind of an undefined scope from the beginning, versus a approach that they use at Caltrain, which is a long-term 10-year deal where the private sector is in charge of everything for an extended period of time. In-house refers to any kind of system that is maintained primarily with in-house managers and staff. The other important distinction and component here is rail transit modes. Heavy rail, light rail, streetcar rail, commuter rail were what we covered in this paper. We don't go into some of the more nuanced modes like a monorail system or a PRT system. There are a few of those in the US and they exist in the databases, but because they're such a niche mode, we really focused on some of the traditional transit modes. And it's important to make these distinctions because they have different regulatory regimes. Commuter rail is regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration, has very defined standards for track maintenance and track design, whereas heavy rail, light rail, streetcar rail have more unique characteristics, can vary quite a bit from agency to agency, and there aren't any federal standards for maintaining the systems. So a different regulatory regime that plays out in our recommendations. And then we took a pretty in-depth look at rail maintenance data. This is just a very high-level look at the National Transit Database, which is a very rich data set that goes back quite a long ways. We put together a multi-year database that we're going to make available on our website. This is free for download. We want folks to take a look at it. And we really surveyed and put a lot of data into the paper about costs, about approaches. Of the 72 rail systems in the country, the majority of them are using in-house labor primarily as their method for rail maintenance. A little over a quarter use private contractors. 9 of the 72 systems have separate ownership, where they're running their systems on tracks owned by freight railroads and therefore are not responsible for the maintenance. And so their data in terms of the cost for rail maintenance is not necessarily included in the data in our table. So we encourage you to take a look at some of the data and research we did in the paper. We found quite a bit of discrepancies between the different agencies. And of course, we note that New York City is the big outlier in this. The vast majority of transit trips on rail are taken in New York, and that weighs very heavily on the data that we have. So again, this is available for download. We want folks to take a look at it, and it helped inform some of the recommendations that I have that I'm going to dive into right now. So the first recommendation, and you'll note that we ordered the recommendations into steps, and we have 5 steps, and we put them that way because they're sequential in nature. You can't necessarily do step 2 or 3 without really looking at step 1. And step 1 is all about asset management. Designing and implementing an effective asset management plan is something that we talk to both folks on the private sector side, on the public sector side, on experts that have been in this industry for a long time. Nobody named a U.S. agency that could claim an effective plan. Fortunately, in 2016, there are new federal rules that now require agencies to put a transit asset management plan together. But this needs several improvements. An effective plan not only has an inventory of assets and a condition-based inventory of what their condition is, it must prioritize them in order of all of the different capital and operational improvements that an agency is trying to do. This is something that is essential for an effective TAM plan. And finally, we have to have performance metrics that demonstrate to the public and to agency boards the actual condition of their system and how it is performing. One of the things that we routinely see is that when there is a maintenance crisis, it always comes at a surprise. Not necessarily to the folks that are working day to day and maintaining the tracks, because they know the problems that exist, but agency boards and the general public are usually taken by surprise when there's some kind of crisis. That's not a good thing to have, and more data and more performance-based and performance measures can help address that problem. When we talked to maintenance managers, they said that they wish the federal law was more stringent. It's easy for agency boards to just meet the minimum federal standards. And so if we increase those federal standards, their thinking is that the agencies will make the investments needed to have truly effective asset management plans. More startup costs, but much better in the long run. The second step is to not negatively affect the compensation of the workforce. So this obviously applies when we start talking about the question of contracting. After a transit asset management plan is underway, an agency can consider contracting, but it has to keep this in mind. For both ethical and legal reasons, it will be hard to replace in-house staff with contracted workers. And we have to remember that the primary benefit of contracting is to bring accountability and better performance. Our research in this paper and with the paper we released with Transit Center last fall shows that agencies pursuing contracting as a means to undercut labor or exclusively cut costs will be left with worse service than they had before. So that leads into step 3, which is we need to track and test alternative methods for infrastructure maintenance. Nobody could come up with definitive reasons why one approach is better than the other, in large part because we haven't done an apples to apples comparison. So after an agency fully addresses step 1 and step 2, it's time to kind of reform some of the agency culture and start measuring the performance of their maintenance department. And we recommend that agencies test 2 different approaches. The first one would be an approach where they contract out a discrete task like a series of interlockings or a section of track where there needs to be a major rehab. They can have a company come in and take care of that and hold them accountable for that, that task and its performance. The other approach is a long-term maintenance of a portion of the system. And we throw an example in the report where a transit system has a dozen lines. They could take one of those lines, contract it out fully, and benchmark that with the other lines in their system in terms of cost, risks, and outcomes, and use this comparison to make future decisions. The last 2 steps, recommendations we have in here are in many ways common sense. They build off of the work that we did in A Bid for Better Transit. They were echoed by everyone that we talked to in this report. But agencies must carry out a fair and functional procurement process. They need to write an effective contract. This is the basis for the agreement that any agency would have with the private sector. It sets up the performance standards. It sets up penalties and incentives for good performance and bad performance, and it underpins the whole system. And so this is might seem obvious, but it's vitally important. And then, of course, the step 5, we can't forget that there is a huge public sector role in administering contracts effectively. The job isn't done once the ink is dry on the contract. But rather agencies need to put that contract up on the shelf and roll up their sleeves and work to make the system function well for the riding public. And this is the partnership aspect of any kind of agreement with a private contractor to do work. The contract administration is vitally important. Of course, we've got lots of details and a few questions that are coming in, but I'm going to end the presentation now. Again, we apologize for the slight disruption there in our webinar, but please use the chat function on the GoToWebinar control panel and send us a few questions, and we'll be happy to answer those and anything else you see in the paper.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So as Paul mentioned, you can continue to submit some questions as as they arise. We've had a few come in already. So there's one about data reporting from agencies on rail maintenance. So what are some of the challenges you've encountered in evaluating the data, and do you have any recommendations to improve for agencies to improve the data reporting process?
That's a good question. I'll take that one and see if Malcolm has any other comments. But we did a pretty detailed analysis using really the only data that's available, which is through the National Transit Database. And the problem with that data is it is self-reported, and it also does not distinguish or it doesn't combine the operational maintenance with the capital maintenance. And each agency defines what is a capital project versus an operational maintenance project a little bit differently. So it was hard to make apples to apples comparisons between agencies. It would also be helpful if we had a little bit more of a time series data that we could see how this is tracked over time, and also a little bit better data on how agencies use contractors. Even those agencies that primarily use in-house staff, they will all occasionally use contractors for either some kind of large project or a unique system like a signaling system or a very complex project that they have ongoing. It would be helpful to know when that happens and how that performed in the data. Malcolm,
the National Transit Database shows nothing about contractor versus in-house. It'll just say, this agency reports such and such data. It doesn't say whether that's a contractor doing the work or the agency in-house staff. So all that information, also a lot of the basic stats about a system, we have to go to the individual agencies to get.
Here's another one on the role of accountability. So why is it expected that contracting results in a higher level of accountability?
The story we like to use there is that you have a point of contact if there's something goes wrong. So we'll take two examples from the Washington, D.C. region. A couple years ago, there was a derailment on the Orange Line where poor track maintenance had a train go off the tracks. It wasn't going very fast. There were no major injuries, but it did disrupt service for quite a while. It was an expensive cleanup and an expensive repair to the interlocking where this happened. And the agency, WMATA, spent a long time pointing fingers at itself to try to figure out who was responsible, what went wrong. There was a lot of internal problems with trying to figure out what happened, and ultimately it was WMATA's responsibility to clean up the mess. Meanwhile, on the Silver Line system, here on the WMATA system, there was a private contractor that was responsible for building the Silver Line. And a few weeks ago, they found out that the contractor was using defective concrete in some of its paneling systems. And because it was the contractor that made the mistake, the contractor is wholly liable for that mistake. And the contractor is now replacing all of the concrete panels on that with no financial risk to WMATA. Obviously, neither party would like this to happen, but it's very clear who is accountable for the mistake, and it's very clear who's going to pay for the mistake, and it assigns that accountability in a way that's very, very clear.
Yeah, contracting, like with public-private partnerships, is about the management of risk. Perhaps more than anything else, it should be looked at as such, not as a way to save costs or as a way to undermine unions, as we said, but as a way to have the private sector entity take on some risk in exchange for some reward. And of course, they have that profit motive, and the motive to want to keep the contract and not lose it to another company. So those help in maintaining accountability.
So there's one comment here that it seems more common for newer light rail systems to outsource maintenance. Do you think that there can or will be any trend for legacy rail systems to move toward or away from outsourcing? And if there will be more of this outsourcing, do you see it only happening as a part of major upgrades?
Well, WMATA is, I think they have an RFP out for the Silver Line for long-term track maintenance just for that line, but I think it would be, I think it might even be the entirety of the line, or is it operations? They want to isolate the Silver Line out from the rest of the system and have it be under contract rather than in-house. That's one legacy, more type legacy type system that's experimenting with that.
Yeah, most of the new systems, the paper found that most systems since the 90s really are primarily using contractors to long-term contracting to maintain their systems. Often that's bundled with operations, although it doesn't have to be. Some of the legacy systems, the systems that have primarily used in-house labor, are expressing some desire to experiment with contracting. We've seen that in Boston. We're seeing that with the Silver Line here in DC. We haven't seen a lot of trend in the other way. Although it does come up in discussion, we haven't seen any system that is currently contracting talking seriously about bringing that in-house.
Yeah, and a lot of the ones that have started up since 1990 are smaller systems. They're agencies that have no experience with rail in a region that hasn't had rail transit in decades. So they want to bring in the expertise from outside rather than having to build up their own expertise within their region. That would take a longer time. And once they've started out with contractors and they don't have any incident, I don't know if they really have an incentive to want to go in-house, whereas on the other side, the legacy systems have been doing it in-house for a long time. So it's sort of you might call it inertia, maybe not the best word, but it's this sort of the way that it establishes itself.
Is there a difference in the life cycle costs to maintain rail that is above ground versus underground?
The data analysis that we have in the paper, and if I would encourage folks to check it out, we look at a kind of a maintenance cost per mile averaged over the past 5 years, varies dramatically across the U.S. In some cases, it's relatively inexpensive, and sometimes you look at some of the numbers and you wonder if the data is actually right. We pulled this from the National Transit Database, and some of it does relate to whether the system is underground or elevated. Some of it has to do when the system was built. I mean, a lot of the tunnels in the older systems in Boston and New York go through very tight turns that have extra pieces of track and extra equipment that's required, and the rail wears out a lot quicker. There are a ton of variables that affect the cost of the system, and so it's hard to say exactly what it costs to maintain an above ground system or a below ground system. What is evident is that the more maintenance is deferred, the more costly it does become to maintain those systems.
There's a quick question about where to find our previous report, Bid for Better Transit, which was referred to earlier in the presentation. That is on our website, and I believe also on Transit Center's website, but you can find it on ours, so do check there. Can you give a few examples of agencies with best practices and what they're doing and why you think those are best practices?
So agencies with best practices, it was something that we wanted to find. We had a hard time finding it. When we talked to folks, there wasn't a ringing endorsement of the state of practice in the U.S., which is why our first recommendation, our first step, was so focused on asset management, something that's fairly basic, that the U.S. is frankly a few decades behind some of its peers abroad. While we didn't really write about a lot of international examples, as that was a little beyond the scope of this project, I would encourage folks to look beyond, especially for for folks that are on the phone from transit agencies. Peer agencies in Europe and Australia seem to have a much better asset management and maintenance regime. Some of that is in-house, some of that is contracted, but overall they seem to do a much better job not only of maintaining their assets, but communicating their state, how they prioritize them, and have some pretty innovative performance metrics, a few of which we put into the paper.
And we'll go ahead with one final question. Wondering if you can speak to the use of technology and special equipment used for track inspection.
So that's one of the fun things that's changing right now, is that the old systems, really kind of developed over the past century, are being replaced by ones that are very data intensive. We didn't find a lot of agencies, or any agencies in the U.S. that I can call out, that use a lot of the data, even though a lot of them are getting the data through their train sets. Sometimes train sets themselves can report data in. Sometimes they have specialized train sets that travel over the track that can record data. But that is very infrequently linked up to a data system that tells the condition of the system, that highlights problem areas and areas that the transit agency needs to address in the short term. We think that's a huge opportunity for a culture change, bringing and digitizing the asset management plan to enable some of this technology to be used to do a much more efficient job of knowing what the agency has, what its condition is, and how to prioritize it, can then pump more resources into the actual labor needed to maintain the system. So again, really kind of streamlining the inspection process using technology that exists today is a huge step in order to help improve the standard of maintenance.
Okay, we had a number of questions that we couldn't get to. If you'd like to follow up, you can reach out to the report authors on this. Again, the report is posted online, so you can also search there for answers to any lingering questions you may have. Thank you all so much for your participation. Eno is planning on staying engaged with this topic in the coming weeks and months, and we encourage you to check out a couple of upcoming Eno events. So next Tuesday, we'll have a webinar, same time on Tuesday, June 12th, on fuel economy and emission standards with Margot Oge, who is the former director of the Office of Transportation and Air Quality at EPA. If you'd like more information about this event, you can check on our website at www.enotrans.org. I'd also encourage you to subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly, an invaluable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice. Once again, many thanks for your participation. Have a great afternoon.